Tonight, we return to a distant past, to the central highlands of what is now Mexico, many centuries before modern cities existed, when the land was shaped by lakes, mountains, and scattered settlements. In this landscape, around the 12th century, a small and uncertain group of people was still moving across the northern regions, without a permanent home, without political power, and without any clear place in the world around them. And yet, over the generations that followed, this same group would build a vast city in the middle of a lake and grow into one of the most remarkable civilizations of its time. As we begin, we may gently wonder how a people without land, without security, and without status could move steadily toward something so enduring, and what belief guided them along the way. In the early 12th century, in the northern regions of what is now Mexico, the people later known as the Aztec were not yet an empire and not yet settled, but were still moving gradually across the land as a migrating group known as the Mexica. At this time, they lived without a fixed home, traveling in small communities that adapted to each new environment, carrying only what they needed and what they could remember. The landscapes they crossed were often dry, with limited water, scattered vegetation, and long distances between reliable sources of food. Other groups had already settled in more fertile areas, forming stable communities and cultivating land that could support growing populations. Compared to these societies, the Mexica were seen as outsiders, people without territory, without established roots, and without a recognized place in the regional order. They were often described using a word that suggested a life lived beyond settled civilization, associated with movement, survival, and a lack of permanence. And yet, within their own understanding, their movement was not without direction. They believed they had been guided away from an earlier homeland, and that their journey was leading somewhere, even if that destination had not yet been found. So they continued, year after year, generation after generation, moving across unfamiliar terrain, learning to adapt to changing conditions, and developing skills that allowed them to survive where others might not. Children grew up within this movement, learning early how to observe the land, how to find food, and how to endure uncertainty. And over time, this way of life began to shape them. They became resilient, they became attentive, and they began to see themselves not simply as wanderers, but as a people moving towards something that had not yet revealed itself. By the late 12th century, their journey had already lasted for generations. They had not yet found a place to settle, but they had developed the ability to endure. And as they moved further south, the world around them began to change. By the late 12th century, as the Mexica continued their long migration southward into the central regions of what is now Mexico, their journey began to enter a quieter but more defining phase, one that would slowly reshape not only where they lived, but how they understood their place in the world. At this point in time, they were still without permanent land, still moving between unfamiliar territories, and still dependent on their ability to adapt to each new environment they encountered along the way. Yet something around them was beginning to change. The land itself was different. The dry northern regions, which had shaped their earlier movement, gradually gave way to valleys where water was more accessible, where soil could support cultivation, and where earlier societies had already chosen to remain, not temporarily, but across generations. And these were not empty lands. They were already occupied. Across these valleys, structured communities had formed over time, places where people no longer moved in search of survival, but instead stayed, built, organized, and developed systems that allowed stability to continue from one generation to the next. For the Mexica, this presented something new. Not a challenge of nature, but a challenge of presence. because land was no longer something they could simply move into. It belonged to others. And as this became increasingly clear, their movement began to slow, not because they had reached their destination, but because the space available to them was becoming more limited. Rather than entering these established areas directly, they remained at the edges, settling in places that others had chosen to avoid, where the land was less stable, less fertile, and often more difficult to live upon. These marginal spaces were not ideal. Some were dry and uneven, making cultivation uncertain, and others were close to water sources that could shift unpredictably, flooding during certain seasons and receding during others, creating conditions that required constant adjustment. But for the Mexica, this was not unfamiliar. They had spent generations learning how to survive in places where stability was never guaranteed. And so, they remained. They built simple shelters from materials that could be gathered and replaced, structures that reflected not permanence but readiness, always prepared for the possibility that they might need to move again. Food was never fully secure. Water had to be located, protected, and sometimes rationed, and each new place required them to learn, once again, how to live within it. Yet, as this continued, something subtle began to shift. They were no longer only surviving. They were observing. Living near more established societies allowed them to see things they had not experienced before, not from a distance, but from close enough to notice patterns. They saw how land was divided, how crops were grown in predictable cycles, how leadership was maintained not through movement but through structure. And perhaps, most importantly, they began to see what stability looked like. This did not immediately change their situation. They still had no land of their own. They still depended on the tolerance of others. And they still existed at the margins of a system they did not control. But over time, these observations began to settle into something deeper, a quiet understanding. That survival alone was not the end of their journey. There was something beyond it. As this realization developed, the Mexica also began to take on more defined roles within the regions they passed through, offering their abilities where they could, particularly in conflict, where their adaptability and endurance made them effective. And gradually, they became known, not as a settled people, but as capable ones, as those who could move, respond, and endure in ways that others could not. This reputation did not elevate them to equality, but it created opportunity. They were sometimes allowed to remain near settlements, not as members of those societies, but as useful outsiders, present but not fully included. Daily life during this period reflected that fragile balance. They lived close enough to observe, but not close enough to belong. They worked, adapted, and waited, aware that their position could change at any moment. Permission could be withdrawn, conditions could shift, and movement once again could become necessary. And yet, despite this uncertainty, something within them was becoming more defined. They no longer saw themselves only as wanderers. They were becoming a people in transition, a people moving, not without direction, but toward something that had not yet revealed itself. By the early 13th century, their movement brought them closer to a region that would become central to everything that followed. A highland basin surrounded by mountains. A place where lakes shaped the land, and where power was already deeply established. This was the Valley of Mexico, and as they approached it, slowly, carefully, and without control over what awaited them, they were moving into a world where survival alone would no longer be enough, and where the path ahead would require them to become something entirely new. By the early 13th century, as the Mexica continued their gradual movement southward, their journey brought them closer to a region that differed from anything they had encountered before. A place where geography, power, and long-established systems came together to form a world far more structured than the one they had known. This region was the Valley of Mexico. Surrounded by mountains and defined by a series of interconnected lakes, the valley created a natural basin where communities had not only settled, but remained, developed, and expanded over generations, forming societies that were no longer shaped by movement but by permanence. At this point in time, the valley was already home to multiple city-states, each with its own leadership, its own territory, and its own position within a broader network of alliances, rivalries, and shifting balances of power. These were not isolated settlements. They were organized systems, and for the Mexica, entering this environment required a different kind of awareness. Because here, space was not simply land. It was controlled, defined, and often contested. As they moved into the outer regions of the valley, the Mexica did not arrive as equals. They arrived as outsiders, a group without land, without established alliances, and without a recognized position within the structure that already existed. And this shaped how they were received. In some areas, they were tolerated. In others, they were pushed away, and in many cases, they were allowed to remain only under specific conditions, often expected to provide labor or service in exchange for temporary settlement. This was not stability, it was negotiation, a constant adjustment to the expectations of others, where their presence depended not on ownership, but on usefulness. Yet even within these limitations, the Mexica continued to adapt. They observed how the valley functioned, not only in terms of power, but in terms of daily life. They saw how water was managed across the lakes, how land was divided and cultivated, and how communities maintained themselves within a shared environment that required coordination as much as control. For the first time, they were not simply surviving within nature. They were witnessing a system that had learned how to shape it. And this observation began to matter, because it introduced a different possibility, that life did not have to depend on movement, that stability, though difficult to achieve, could be created. As I reflect on this period, there is something quietly significant in how proximity changes understanding, how being near a system, even without being part of it, allows patterns to become visible in ways that distance never could. For the Mexica, this proximity was not comfortable. They lived at the edges, in spaces that were often less desirable, sometimes unstable, and frequently temporary, places where the land did not fully support them, and where their position could shift at any moment. Daily life reflected this uncertainty. Shelters were built with the expectation that they might not last. Food depended on both gathering and limited cultivation, and each day required an awareness of the conditions around them, not only environmental but social. Who controlled the land, who allowed them to remain, and how long that permission might continue. Yet within this instability, something began to take shape. They were no longer only reacting, they were learning. And learning, over time, began to influence how they saw themselves, not simply as a group moving through spaces, but as one that might eventually claim a place within them. By the mid-13th century, their presence within the valley had become more consistent, though still without permanence. They moved between locations. They adjusted to changing conditions. And they continued to exist within a system that had not yet fully accepted them. But the direction of their journey had changed. They were no longer moving through open land. They were moving within a structured world. And that difference would define everything that followed. Because in a place where power was already established, and where land was already claimed, finding a place was no longer about arrival. It was about positioning. And as the Mexica continued to move within the valley, gradually learning its structure, its tensions, and its possibilities, they were not only approaching a destination, They were approaching a moment where movement would no longer be enough, and where survival would begin to depend on something more, something that would require them to change, not just where they lived, but who they were becoming. By the mid-13th century, as the Mexica continued to move within the Valley of Mexico, their presence had become more regular, yet still uncertain, shaped by a reality in which they existed not at the center of power, but along its outer edges, close enough to observe, but never fully included. At this point in time, the valley was not controlled by a single authority, but by multiple city-states, each maintaining its own influence over surrounding lands, and each competing, cooperating, and adjusting within a shifting balance that defined the region. Among these, some held greater power than others. Cities such as Azcapotzalco had begun to extend their influence more widely, establishing control over nearby areas and shaping the political structure of the valley in ways that smaller groups, like the Mexica, could not ignore. For the Mexica, this meant that survival was no longer only about adapting to the land. It was about navigating power, understanding who controlled which territories, recognizing where they could remain, and knowing when they needed to move. Their settlements during this period reflected that uncertainty. They were often temporary, placed in areas that others did not fully claim, or in spaces where their presence could be tolerated for a time, locations that offered just enough stability to live, but never enough to fully settle. These were not ideal conditions. The land was often difficult to cultivate, and access to reliable water could vary depending on the season, requiring constant adjustment and awareness of the environment. Yet even within these limitations, daily life continued. Families formed routines. Food was gathered, grown where possible, and shared. Shelters were maintained, repaired, and rebuilt when needed. Each structure a reflection not of permanence but of resilience. And within this daily rhythm, something deeper began to develop. The Mexica were not only surviving within the valley, they were learning how it functioned. They observed how stronger city-states organized their territories, how tribute flowed from smaller communities to larger ones, and how power was maintained not only through force, but through structure. This was a different kind of knowledge, not immediate, not always visible, but gradually forming a clearer picture of how stability could be created and sustained over time. At the same time, their role within the valley began to take on a more defined shape. They were not landowners, they were not rulers, but they were useful. In particular, they became known for their effectiveness in conflict, offering their service as warriors to more powerful groups who required support in maintaining or expanding their influence. This role did not place them at the center of power, but it gave them access to it. Through participation, they began to understand how decisions were made, how alliances were formed, and how strength could be organized beyond individual survival. As I reflect on this phase, there is something quietly significant in how proximity to power, even without possessing it, can shape understanding in ways that are not immediately visible, how being near structure allows patterns to emerge, and how those patterns over time begin to influence what a group believes is possible. For the Mexica, and this influence did not create immediate change. They remained without land, they remained dependent, and they remained within a system that did not fully include them, but their position was no longer passive. They were observing with intention, learning with purpose, and slowly, though not yet visibly, beginning to position themselves within a structure that they had not created, but were starting to understand. By the late 13th century, this process had begun to shape how the Mexica moved within the valley. Their decisions were no longer only reactive. They were becoming strategic, choosing where to remain, whom to align with, and how to maintain their presence within an environment where space, power, and opportunity were all limited. This did not remove uncertainty. It did not grant them security, but it marked a shift from movement without direction to movement with awareness. And as this awareness continued to develop, as they remained close to power without yet possessing it, the conditions were forming for a transition that would move them beyond survival, toward something more stable, something more deliberate, and something that would eventually allow them to claim a place within the valley, not as outsiders, but as participants in the system itself. By the late 13th century, as the Mexica continued to live within the Valley of Mexico, their role within the region had become more defined, shaped not by ownership of land, but by their growing connection to the powers that controlled it, a position that offered both opportunity and continued uncertainty. At this point in time, the political structure of the valley had become increasingly influenced by stronger city-states, particularly Azcapotzalco, whose authority extended across multiple surrounding areas, creating a system in which smaller groups were expected to align, serve, or adapt in order to remain. For the Mexica, this environment required more than survival. It required positioning. They could no longer move freely without consequence, nor could they remain without recognition. Their continued presence depended on their ability to offer something of value within a system that was already defined by hierarchy and control. And it was here that their role as warriors became more central. They began to serve larger powers, participating in conflicts that were not originally their own, but which allowed them to demonstrate discipline, endurance, and adaptability, qualities that made them increasingly useful within a competitive and often unstable political landscape. This service did not grant them independence, but it created proximity. They were allowed to remain in certain areas, to operate within the margins of stronger systems, and to exist not as equals, but as contributors to a structure they did not control. Over time, this proximity began to change how they were perceived. They were no longer simply wanderers moving through the valley. They became known as a group that could be relied upon in specific situations, particularly in conflict, where consistency and resilience were valued. Yet this recognition came with limits. They were still without land of their own, still dependent on the permission of others, and still positioned within a system where their role, though useful, could be altered or removed at any time. Daily life during this period reflected that balance. They lived close to centers of power, yet remained separate from them, maintaining their own structures, their own routines, and their own internal organization, even as they operated within the expectations set by others. Food was more stable than in earlier periods, though still not guaranteed. Access to land for cultivation existed, but was often controlled and conditional. And each decision, whether to remain or to move, required careful awareness of the political environment around them. As I reflect on this phase, there is something quietly significant in how groups, when placed near power without possessing it, begin to develop a different kind of strength, one that is not based on control, but on understanding, adaptation, and the ability to move within systems that were not designed for them. For the Mexica, this strength was still forming. They were learning not only how power operated, but how to exist alongside it, how to remain useful without becoming dependent, and how to observe without being fully seen. By the end of the 13th century, their position within the valley had become more stable than before, though still without permanence. They were no longer constantly moving. They had found places where they could remain for longer periods, and within those places their identity began to take on a clearer shape. They were no longer only defined by movement. They were becoming defined by role, by function, by their place within a larger system. Yet, even as this stability developed, it remained conditional. dependent on relationships, on usefulness, and on the shifting priorities of those who held power within the valley. And this meant that their position, though improved, was still not secure. They had learned how to exist within the system, but they had not yet found a way to belong within it. And as this tension between presence and belonging continued, as they remained close to power, yet outside of it, the need for something more permanent began to take shape, not as a sudden desire, but as a gradual realization that survival within the system was not enough, and that at some point, they would need a place of their own, a place that was not given, but claimed, within a world where every piece of land already had someone who controlled it. By the late 13th century, as the Mexica continued to serve within the political structure of the Valley of Mexico, their growing usefulness began to bring them closer to a moment that would quietly change the direction of their future, not through immediate power, but through an opportunity shaped by both necessity and limitation. At this point in time, their position remained dependent. They were still without land of their own, still operating within the influence of stronger powers, particularly Azcapotzalco, whose authority shaped much of the valley's political landscape. Yet their role as warriors had given them value, and value, within a structured system, could be exchanged, not for equality, but for space. It was within this context that the Mexica were granted permission to settle in a specific area, a place that was not contested by others, not because it held no importance, but because it presented conditions that were difficult, unstable, and largely avoided. This place was within the waters of Lake Texcoco. At first, it did not resemble what might be considered land. It was a collection of marshy islands, surrounded by shallow water, where the ground shifted, where the soil was uneven, and where building anything permanent required constant adjustment. For more established societies, this environment offered little advantage. It was difficult to cultivate, unstable to construct upon, and isolated from the more solid and controlled territories around the lake. But for the Mexica, this was not a disadvantage. It was an opening, because for the first time, they were not settling at the edge of someone else's land. They were settling in a place that others had chosen not to claim, a space where control, though limited by nature, belonged to them. The transition was not immediate. They did not arrive and build a city. They arrived and began again. Shelters were constructed using available materials, designed to withstand the shifting ground. Wood, reeds, and earth were combined carefully, forming structures that could adapt to the instability beneath them. Water was everywhere. It surrounded them, moved beneath them, and shaped every decision they made. Food remained uncertain at first. Fishing became essential. Small-scale cultivation began where possible, though the conditions required experimentation, learning how to work with soil that was not fixed and water that could not always be controlled. Yet within this environment, something began to change. They were no longer simply adjusting to land. They were beginning to shape it. Over time, they developed methods to stabilize sections of ground, creating small areas that could support crops, extending outward slowly into the shallow waters, not as natural land, but as constructed space. These early efforts were modest, but they marked a shift, from adaptation to creation. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly powerful in how limitation can become opportunity, when the conditions that restrict others create space for those who have learned to adapt. Because what was unlivable for some became the foundation for others. Daily life during this period required constant attention. Structures had to be maintained. Water levels had to be observed. Food sources had to be balanced between what could be grown and what could be gathered from the lake. Movement was different here. Canoes replaced walking across open ground, Paths were not fixed. They shifted with the environment, and the boundary between land and water was never fully stable. Yet, despite these challenges, something had changed. This was no longer temporary. They were not waiting to move. They were building. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. And with each passing year, the space they occupied became more defined, more organized, and more capable of supporting a growing population. By the early 14th century, this settlement had begun to take on a clearer form. It was still small, still limited, but it was theirs. Not granted in full ownership, not free from external influence, but no longer entirely dependent on the margins of others. And within that difference, something deeper began to emerge. A sense of place, not just where they lived, but where they could remain. And as this sense of place continued to develop, as they shaped the land from water and structure from instability, the foundation was being formed for something that would grow beyond what this moment could yet reveal. Because in the years that followed, this small and uncertain settlement would begin to transform into a city unlike any other in the valley. By the early 14th century, as the Mexica continued to live within the marshy islands of Lake Texcoco, their settlement, though still modest and shaped by constant adaptation, had begun to develop a sense of continuity, a place that was no longer temporary but not yet fully defined. At this point in time, they remained under the broader influence of dominant powers within the valley, particularly Azcapotzalco, and their position, while more stable than before, was still dependent on the structure that surrounded them. Yet, within their own community, something deeper had begun to take form, a shared identity, not only as a group that had survived movement and hardship, but as one that had reached a place where settlement, however difficult, could begin to take root. It was during this period, traditionally dated to the year 1325, that a moment occurred which would later be remembered not only as a decision, but as a symbol, the one that would define how the Mexica understood the place they had come to inhabit. According to their tradition, they had long been guided by a sign, a vision that would indicate where they were meant to establish themselves permanently, not just as a temporary settlement, but as a place of origin. And in this landscape of water and shifting ground, that sign was recognized. An eagle standing upon a cactus, rising from the land within the lake. For the Mexica, this was not interpreted as coincidence. It was understood as confirmation that the place they had reached, difficult as it was, unstable as it seemed, was the place they were meant to remain. And within that understanding, the settlement took on a new meaning. It was no longer only a practical decision. It became a defined beginning. From this point forward, the place they had built upon the water was known as Tenochtitlan. The name itself carried significance, tied to both place and identity, marking the transition from a group in movement to a people with a center. Yet the founding of Tenochtitlan did not immediately transform their conditions. The challenges remained. The land was still unstable. Water still shaped every aspect of daily life, and the system of power within the valley still placed them in a position of dependency. But something had changed. They were no longer searching. They were building with intention. Structures became more organized. Pathways began to take form. And the early layout of the city, though simple, started to reflect a sense of planning rather than temporary adjustment. At the same time, their methods of working with the environment continued to develop. The construction of cultivated land within the lake expanded, allowing for more reliable food production and gradually increasing the capacity of the settlement to support a larger population. These developments did not happen quickly. They unfolded over years. Through repetition, through trial and error, and through a growing understanding of how to shape an environment that had once seemed resistant to settlement. Daily life remained demanding. Water had to be navigated, structures had to be maintained, and each season brought changes that required attention and adaptation. Yet, within this demanding environment, stability began to emerge, not as something fixed, but as something sustained. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how a place becomes meaningful, not only through what it offers, but through what is built within it. How difficulty, when accepted and worked with over time, can become the foundation for something lasting. For the Mexica, Tenochtitlan was not chosen because it was easy. It was chosen because it was possible, and over time, that possibility began to grow. By the mid-14th century, the settlement had expanded beyond its earliest form. More structures, more cultivated land, more defined spaces. And with this growth, a clearer sense of organization began to take shape. They were still not among the dominant powers of the valley. They still operated within a system controlled by others, but they now possessed something they had not had before. A place that was theirs. A center from which they could begin to develop not only as a community, but as a society. And as Tenochtitlan continued to grow, rising gradually from the waters of Lake Texcoco, it carried within it the beginnings of something that extended beyond survival, beyond adaptation, toward a future where this small settlement would become one of the most influential cities in the region, and where the people who had once lived at the edges of power would begin to move toward its center. By the mid-14th century, as Tenochtitlan continued to grow upon the waters of Lake Texcoco, the Mexica faced a challenge that would define not only their survival, but the future structure of their city. How to create stability in a place where the ground itself could not be trusted. At this point in time, their settlement had expanded beyond its earliest form. More families had gathered, more structures had been built, and the need for consistent food production had become increasingly urgent, as the population grew within a space that offered very little natural farmland. The lake provided resources. Fish could be caught. Water was abundant, but land, stable and reliable land, remained limited, and without it, growth could not continue. It was within this constraint that the Mexica began to develop one of their most important innovations, a system that would allow them to create land where none had existed before. These were the early forms of chinampas. Constructed within the shallow waters of the lake, chinampas were not natural islands, but carefully built plots of agricultural land, formed by layering mud, vegetation, and organic material, held in place by stakes and roots, and gradually stabilized over time. The process required patience. Sections of the lake bed were marked. Materials were gathered and arranged. And over repeated cycles, the land became firm enough to support crops. This was not a quick transformation. It unfolded slowly, through effort, through observation, and through a growing understanding of how water and earth could be combined. Once established, these cultivated areas proved remarkably productive. The surrounding water helped regulate temperature and moisture, allowing crops to grow more consistently and often more abundantly than in dry land farming. This did not remove all difficulty. The structures required maintenance. Edges had to be reinforced, and the balance between water and soil had to be carefully managed, yet the system worked. And as it expanded, it began to change the conditions of life within Tenochtitlan. Food became more stable, harvests more predictable, and the capacity of the city to support a larger population increased. Daily life began to adjust to this new structure. Movement across the city relied increasingly on canals. Canoes became essential, not only for transport, but for maintaining the agricultural system itself. Paths of water connected different areas, creating a pattern of movement that was unlike the land-based cities of the valley. Work followed a steady rhythm. planting, maintaining, harvesting, and repeating, each cycle contributing to a system that depended not on expansion into new land, but on the continuous shaping of the space already occupied. As I reflect on this development, there is something quietly remarkable in how necessity can lead to innovation, and how limitation, when approached with persistence, can become a source of strength rather than restriction. Because the Mexica did not find fertile land, they created it, and in doing so they transformed an environment that had once seemed unstable into one that could support long-term growth. By the late 14th century, the Chinampa system had expanded significantly, forming a network of cultivated areas that extended outward from the core of the city, increasing both its physical size and its ability to sustain life. This expansion was not only agricultural, it was structural. It defined how the city would grow, how it would organize itself, and how it would maintain balance within an environment where water and land were always in close relationship. Tenochtitlan was no longer simply a settlement built on unstable ground. It was becoming a system, one in which land was shaped, water was managed, and growth was no longer limited by the absence of natural resources. Yet, even as this system strengthened, the Mexica remained within the broader political structure of the valley. They had built stability within their own space, but they had not yet secured their position within the system of power that surrounded them. And as their city continued to grow, as their ability to sustain themselves became more evident, their presence would become more visible, not only as a community that had survived, but as one that was beginning to develop strength, in a way that others could no longer ignore. By the late 14th century, as Tenochtitlan continued to expand across the waters of Lake Texcoco, the city was no longer defined only by its ability to sustain life, but by how that life was being organized, gradually, deliberately, and with increasing structure. At this point in time, the Mexica had secured a level of stability within their environment, supported by the expansion of chinampas, the development of canal-based movement, and a growing population that no longer depended solely on survival, but on coordination. And with that coordination came the need for order. The city, though still developing, began to take on a more defined layout. Pathways were no longer formed only by necessity. They were shaped with intention. Canals were extended and connected, and residential areas began to cluster, and spaces within the city started to serve specific functions rather than remaining interchangeable. This did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually, through repeated use, through adjustment, and through a growing awareness that a larger population required a more consistent structure to function effectively. At the same time, leadership within the Mexica community began to take on a clearer form. Decisions could no longer be made informally or through temporary arrangements. They required continuity, direction, and recognition. Leaders emerged not only through lineage, but through their ability to guide, organize, and maintain balance within a system that was becoming increasingly complex. This early form of leadership was still closely connected to the community. It was not yet distant or highly formalized, but it marked a shift. From a group that moved together to one that was beginning to be guided. And alongside this development, another element began to take shape within the city. A central space, not defined by residence or agriculture, but by meaning. The early temple structures of Tenochtitlan began to rise. At first, they were modest, constructed from available materials, maintained through effort, and shaped by the same conditions that influenced every other part of the city. Yet, their importance did not depend on size, it depended on function. These spaces became points of gathering, of ceremony, of shared belief, and in a city that had grown from uncertainty, they provided something that extended beyond physical survival. They provided continuity of identity. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how cities do not become centers of power simply through growth, but through the creation of spaces that organize meaning. Places where people not only live, but understand themselves as part of something larger. For the Mexica, this development was still in its early stages. Their structures were not yet monumental. Their systems were not yet dominant, but the foundations were forming. The city was no longer just a place to remain. It was becoming a place to organize. Daily life continued to follow the rhythms established in earlier years. Farming, transport, construction, and maintenance all required attention. But now, these activities were increasingly coordinated within a shared structure that allowed the city to function more efficiently as a whole. People moved with greater purpose, spaces were used with greater consistency, and the patterns of life within Tenochtitlan became more predictable. This predictability did not remove challenge. Water levels still changed, structures still required maintenance, and resources still needed to be managed carefully. But within this environment, the Mexica had begun to create something that extended beyond adaptation. They were building a system, one that connected land, water, people, and belief into a structure that could continue beyond a single generation. By the end of the 14th century, Tenochtitlan had grown into more than a settlement. It had become a functioning city, not yet the center of power within the valley, but no longer at its edges. It existed within the system, visible, developing, and increasingly defined by its internal organization. And as this organization continued to strengthen, as leadership became clearer and shared identity more structured, the next phase of its development would not only depend on how it functioned internally, but on how it positioned itself within the wider balance of power that surrounded it, a balance that would soon begin to shift. By the late 14th century, as Tenochtitlan continued to develop its internal structure and strengthen its ability to sustain a growing population, its position within the wider Valley of Mexico became more clearly defined, not as an independent power, but as a subordinate presence within a system dominated by stronger forces. At this point in time, the city-state of Azcapotzalco stood as one of the most influential powers in the region, extending its control across surrounding territories through a combination of military strength, strategic alliances, and an established system of tribute. This was not a loose influence. It was structured. Communities within its reach were expected to contribute resources, labor, and support, forming a network that reinforced its dominance and allowed it to maintain stability across a wide and varied landscape. For the Mexica, this meant that their growing city did not exist in isolation. Tenochtitlan, though developing internally, was positioned within the influence of Azcapotzalco, and its continued growth depended on maintaining a relationship with that power. This relationship was not equal. It was defined by obligation. The Mexica provided service, particularly in warfare, supporting the expansion and control of Azcapotzalco in exchange for the ability to remain, develop, and continue building their city within the lake. This arrangement, while limiting, also offered opportunity. Through participation in military campaigns, the Mexica gained experience. They learned how conflicts were organized, how alliances were formed, and how power was extended beyond a single city. They were no longer observing from the edges. They were participating within the system itself. Yet their role remained clearly defined. They were not decision-makers. They were contributors. Their actions supported a structure that they did not control, and their position within it depended on their continued usefulness. Daily life in Tenochtitlan during this period reflected this dual reality. Within the city, organization continued to improve. Agriculture expanded, canals supported movement, and the population grew within a system that was becoming more stable with each passing year. But beyond the city, obligations remained. Tribute had to be delivered. Military service had to be provided, and the relationship with Azcapotzalco required constant awareness, as any change in that balance could affect their ability to remain and develop. As I reflect on this phase, there is something quietly instructive in how growth can occur within limitation, and how systems of power often allow development, not out of generosity, but because it serves their own structure, creating conditions where those within the system can strengthen, even while remaining constrained. For the Mexica, this was a period of learning through participation. They were gaining knowledge not from distance but from involvement. They were understanding how power operated from within its structure, even if they did not yet possess it themselves. Over time, this experience began to shape their position. They were no longer seen only as a marginal group. They became recognized as a reliable force, particularly in conflict, where their discipline and adaptability contributed to the success of larger campaigns. This recognition did not elevate them to independence, but it changed how they were perceived. They were becoming visible, not just as inhabitants of a city within the lake, but as participants in the system of power that defined the valley. By the end of the 14th century, Tenochtitlan had reached a point where its internal stability and external role were both clearly established. It was a city that could sustain itself, and it was a city that served within a larger structure. Yet, within this position, a quiet tension existed, because participation in power also brings understanding, and understanding, over time, can lead to something more. As the Mexica continued to serve, to learn, and to grow within the influence of Azcapotzalco, they were not only strengthening the system they belonged to, they were preparing themselves for a moment when that system would begin to change, and when their role within it would no longer remain the same. By the early 15th century, as Tenochtitlan continued to grow in both structure and population, the balance of power within the Valley of Mexico began to shift in ways that were gradual at first, yet increasingly difficult to ignore, creating conditions that would open the possibility for change. At this point in time, Azcapotzalco still stood as the dominant force in the region, maintaining its authority through a network of tribute and military control that extended across multiple city-states. Yet, beneath this dominance, tensions had begun to form, not always visible, not always immediate, but present within the relationships that connected the system together. Some cities had grown stronger. Others had begun to question the weight of obligation placed upon them. And within this environment, the stability that had once defined Azcapotzalco's control was no longer absolute. For the Mexica, this shift was significant. They had spent decades serving within this system, learning its structure, participating in its campaigns, and understanding how power was organized across the valley. They were no longer inexperienced. They were no longer observers. They were a part of the system, and that meant they could recognize when it began to change. Within Tenochtitlan, growth continued. Agriculture expanded, population increased, and the internal organization of the city became more refined, allowing it to function with greater efficiency and coordination. Yet this growth also created a new awareness. They were no longer only sustaining themselves. They were becoming capable of supporting larger efforts, capable of contributing more significantly and gradually, capable of imagining a different position within the system. At the same time, relationships between city-states began to shift. Alliances were reconsidered, loyalties were tested, and the balance that had once centered around Azcapotzalco began to show signs of strain. This was not yet open conflict. It was a period of adjustment, of observation, of positioning. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly revealing in how systems of power rarely change through sudden collapse, but through the accumulation of small shifts, changes in strength, in perception, and in opportunity that, over time, create conditions where new possibilities can emerge. For the Mexica, this was a moment of awareness. They understood the system, they understood their role within it, and they could begin to see where that role might expand. Yet this possibility carried risk, because moving beyond a defined position within a system requires not only strength, but timing. And timing, within a structure shaped by multiple powers, is never fully certain. Within the valley, tensions continued to build. Some city-states sought greater independence. Others remained aligned with existing power. And between these positions, a space began to open, one where alliances could shift, and where new configurations of power could take shape. For Tenochtitlan, this was not yet a moment of action. It was a moment of preparation, of watching, of understanding when and how to move. By the early decades of the 15th century, the Mexica had reached a point where their internal strength and external awareness were aligned. They had the capacity to act, but they had not yet chosen to do so. And in that space, between capability and action, the future of their position within the valley remained undefined. Because when a system begins to shift, those who understand it best are often the ones who are most prepared to change it. And as the balance of power within the Valley of Mexico continued to move, as alliances weakened and new opportunities emerged, the Mexica stood at a threshold, no longer confined to the role they had once held, but not yet transformed into what they would become, waiting for a moment when the system they had served would open, just enough to be reshaped. By the late 1420s, as the shifting balance of power within the Valley of Mexico reached a point where tension could no longer remain contained, the system that had long been centered around Azcapotzalco began to move toward open conflict, creating a moment in which long-standing relationships would be tested and new structures would begin to form. At this point in time, Azcapotzalco still held formal authority over much of the region, yet its control had become increasingly strained. Leadership within the city faced internal challenges. Alliances that had once been stable were weakening, and the demands placed upon surrounding communities had begun to create resistance rather than compliance. For the Mexica, this moment did not arrive unexpectedly. They had observed these shifts. They understood the structure, and they recognized that the system they had long served was no longer as stable as it once appeared. What followed was not an isolated decision but a coordinated movement. Tenochtitlan did not act alone. Instead, it formed alliances with other city-states that had also begun to resist the dominance of Azcapotzalco, most notably Texcoco and later Tlacopan, creating a coalition that combined resources, knowledge, and military strength. This alliance was not formed out of similarity. Each city had its own interests, its own position, and its own reasons for participating. But together, they created a force capable of challenging a system that had once seemed unshakable. The conflict that followed was not defined by a single battle. It unfolded over time, through campaigns, through shifting control of territory, and through a gradual weakening of Azcapotzalco's ability to maintain its authority across the region. For the Mexica, this was a turning point. They were no longer acting within the system. They were acting against it. Their role had changed, from contributors to challengers. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how those who spend the most time within a system often understand best how it can be changed, not through force alone, but through timing, coordination, and the recognition of when stability has begun to weaken. By 1428, the conflict reached its conclusion. Azcapotzalco fell. Its dominance, which had shaped the valley for decades, came to an end, and the structure that had once held the system together was replaced by something new. In its place, the alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan was formalized, creating what would later be known as the Triple Alliance. This was not simply a military agreement. It was a reorganization of power, a system in which authority, resources, and influence were distributed among the three cities, each contributing to a structure that extended across the valley and beyond. For the Mexica, this marked a profound transformation. They were no longer a subordinate group operating within someone else's system. They had become a central part of a new one. Their position had shifted, their influence had expanded, and their city, once built in the margins of the lake, now stood at the center of a growing network of power. Yet this transformation did not immediately create stability. It created opportunity, and opportunity, when combined with new authority, requires direction. The alliance provided structure, but it also introduced new questions: how power would be shared, how expansion would be managed, and how the system would maintain balance across a region that had just undergone significant change. Daily life in Tenochtitlan continued. The canals remained active. Agriculture sustained the population, and the city continued to grow. But now, that growth existed within a different context, no longer defined by dependency, but by participation in power. By the mid-15th century, the Mexica had entered a new phase of their history, one in which their understanding of the system would no longer be used only to navigate it, but to shape it. And as the Triple Alliance began to extend its influence outward, as campaigns expanded, and tribute networks began to form under its control, the Mexica stood at the beginning of a transformation, from a people who had once lived at the edges of power, to one that would now define it across much of the region. By the mid-15th century, in the years following the fall of Azcapotzalco in 1428, the newly formed Triple Alliance began to move beyond consolidation and into expansion, extending its influence outward in a way that would gradually reshape the structure of the Valley of Mexico and the regions beyond it. At this point in time, the alliance between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan was not only a political arrangement, but a functional system, one that allowed coordinated action across multiple territories, combining military strength with shared interest. Yet expansion was not immediate in scale. It unfolded gradually, through campaigns that extended influence step by step, rather than attempting to control everything at once. Nearby regions were the first to be affected. Communities that had once operated independently or under previous systems now found themselves drawn into a new structure, one defined by the authority of the alliance. For the Mexica, this marked a shift in role once again. They were no longer only participants in a shared system. They were becoming one of its driving forces. Their experience in warfare, combined with their growing organizational capacity, allowed them to take a leading position in the expansion process, shaping how the alliance extended its reach across the region. Yet expansion was not based solely on conquest. It required sustainability, and sustainability required structure. It was within this context that the tribute system began to take form. Rather than fully replacing local leadership, the alliance allowed many communities to maintain their internal organization, while requiring them to provide regular contributions in the form of goods, labor, or resources. This approach created a different kind of control, one that did not depend on constant presence but on consistent obligation. Goods began to move toward the center. Textiles, food, crafted items, and materials from different regions were collected and transported along established routes, creating a flow that connected distant communities to the core cities of the alliance. For Tenochtitlan, this system had a profound effect. Resources increased, variety expanded, and the city, already supported by its own agricultural system, began to receive goods that extended beyond what it could produce locally. Daily life within the city reflected this change. Markets became more active, trade increased, and the presence of goods from different regions created a sense of connection to a wider world that extended beyond the lake. Yet this system also introduced new dynamics. Communities that provided tribute were not equal participants. Their relationship to the alliance was defined by obligation, and that obligation required consistency over time. As I reflect on this development, there is something quietly significant in how systems of expansion are sustained not only through strength, but through organization. How the ability to maintain a network over distance depends on structure as much as it does on initial conquest. For the Mexica, this period represented the beginning of something larger than the city itself. They were no longer only building Tenochtitlan. They were building a system that extended beyond it, one that connected multiple regions through movement, obligation, and coordination. Over time, this system became more defined. Routes were established, expectations were clarified, and the flow of tribute became a regular part of how the alliance maintained its influence across distance. By the late 15th century, the effects of this expansion were visible. The reach of the alliance had grown. The number of connected communities had increased. And Tenochtitlan, as one of the central cities, he had become a focal point within a network that was both extensive and increasingly organized. Yet, within this growth, there remained a balance that needed to be maintained. Because expansion, while creating strength, also creates dependency. The system relied on continued contribution, on stable relationships, and on the ability to manage both distance and difference across the regions it connected. And as this network continued to expand, as more communities became part of the system, the Mexica were not only extending their influence, they were building a structure that, over time, would define the empire itself, in ways that would bring both strength and complexity. By the mid-15th century, in the years following the formation of the Triple Alliance and the early stages of expansion, the structure of power within Tenochtitlan began to take on a more defined and deliberate form, guided in part by leadership that understood not only how to gain influence, but how to organize and sustain it. At this point in time, one of the central figures in this transformation was Itzcoatl, who ruled Tenochtitlan during a period when the city was moving from participation in a shared system of power toward a more active role in shaping it. His leadership did not emerge in isolation. It was supported by advisors and alliances, particularly with figures in Texcoco, who contributed to the development of a more structured and coordinated approach to governance and expansion. Together, they began to define how authority would function within the alliance, not as a loose arrangement, but as a system with direction. Under Itzcoatl, the Mexica did not simply continue expanding. They began to consolidate, to strengthen the internal organization of their city, and to clarify the structure through which decisions were made and authority was exercised. This included reinforcing leadership roles, defining responsibilities more clearly, and establishing patterns of governance that allowed the system to function beyond individual action. At the same time, there was a deliberate effort to shape identity, to define how the Mexica understood themselves within this expanding system, and how others would understand them as well. Historical narratives were reconsidered, stories were organized, and a sense of continuity was established, linking their past movement and survival to their present position within a growing structure of power. This was not simply about memory, it was about meaning, creating a shared understanding of who they were and why their position within the valley was justified. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how power is not only exercised through action, but through narrative. How the way a group understands its own history can influence how it organizes its future. For the Mexica, this process strengthened internal cohesion. It aligned leadership with identity, and it created a foundation upon which further expansion could take place. At the same time, the tribute system continued to develop. Routes became more reliable, expectations more consistent, and the flow of resources more integrated into the daily functioning of the city. Tenochtitlan began to change, not only in size, but in complexity. Markets grew, craft production increased, and the organization of the city reflected a system that was becoming more structured with each passing year. Daily life adapted to this growth. Work became more specialized, roles became more defined, and the rhythm of the city began to reflect not only survival, but coordination across a larger and more interconnected system. Yet, even as this structure strengthened, the balance within the Triple Alliance remained important. Power was shared. Decisions required coordination, and the relationship between Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan continued to shape how the system functioned as a whole. For the Mexica, this was a period of foundation, not defined by rapid change, but by deliberate development. They were building the framework of power, not only expanding outward, but organizing inward. By the late years of Itzcoatl's rule, Tenochtitlan had become more than a participant in the alliance. It had become one of its defining forces. Its influence was growing, its systems were strengthening, and its position within the valley was becoming more central. And as this process continued, as structure, identity, and expansion aligned, the stage was being set for a new phase, one in which the Mexica would not only maintain power, but extend it further, across regions that had not yet been fully drawn into their system, in ways that would continue to reshape the valley and beyond. By the mid-15th century, following the period of consolidation under Itzcoatl, the Mexica entered a new phase of development under the leadership of Moctezuma I, whose reign marked a time when the structure that had been carefully built began to extend outward with greater confidence and scale. At this point in time, the foundations of power were already in place. The Triple Alliance functioned as a coordinated system. The tribute network had begun to form, and Tenochtitlan had developed into a city capable of supporting both growth and organization. Yet under Moctezuma I, expansion accelerated, not as an uncontrolled movement, but as a structured process, guided by an understanding of how to extend influence while maintaining stability within the system. Campaigns reached further. Regions that had once existed beyond the immediate influence of the alliance were gradually drawn into its network, not always through direct control, but through the establishment of obligation and connection. This expansion was deliberate. Each new region added to the system contributed resources, strengthened trade routes, and extended the reach of the alliance across a wider geographic area. For the Mexica, this marked a shift in scale. They were no longer expanding within a familiar environment. They were extending their influence into regions with different conditions, different communities, and different challenges. And this required adaptation, not only in military approach, but in organization, in communication, and in the management of a system that was becoming increasingly complex. Within Tenochtitlan, these changes were reflected in the development of infrastructure. The city continued to grow, not only outward, but in its internal organization. Causeways connecting the city to the mainland were reinforced and expanded, allowing for more reliable movement of people and goods across the lake. Water management systems became more refined. Efforts were made to control the flow of water, separating fresh and salt water where possible, and improving the stability of the environment upon which the city depended. These developments were not immediate. They unfolded over time, through planning, through labor, and through a growing understanding of how to support a city that was now central to a much larger system. Daily life became more structured. Markets expanded in size and activity. Craft production increased, and the presence of goods from distant regions became more common, reflecting the growing reach of the tribute network. Yet, alongside this expansion, expectations also increased. Communities within the system were required to contribute regularly, to maintain their obligations, and to operate within a structure that was becoming more clearly defined with each passing year. As I reflect on this period, there is something quietly significant in how expansion does not only increase power, but also increases responsibility. How the larger a system becomes, the more it depends on coordination, consistency, and the ability to manage complexity across distance. For the Mexica, this was a period of both strength and adjustment. They were extending their influence, but they were also learning how to sustain it, how to maintain balance within a system that was no longer local, but regional. By the latter half of Moctezuma I's reign, the scale of the Mexica system had changed. The number of connected regions had grown. The flow of tribute had increased, and Tenochtitlan had become more clearly positioned as a central hub within a network that extended far beyond the valley. Yet, within this growth, there remained a need for structure, because expansion, if not organized, can lead to instability. And stability for a system of this scale required more than strength. It required design. And as this period continued, as campaigns extended further and the system became more complex, the Mexica were not only building an empire, they were shaping the conditions that would determine how that empire would function and how it would be sustained over time. By the late 15th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to expand following the structured growth under Moctezuma I, the system that had brought strength and stability began to carry a new characteristic: complexity, increasing gradually as the scale of the empire extended across wider regions. At this point in time, leadership passed to Axayacatl, whose reign unfolded within a system that was already large, organized, and functioning across distance, yet also beginning to show the natural pressures that come with continued expansion. The tribute network had grown. More regions were connected. More goods were flowing toward Tenochtitlan, and the city itself had become a central hub within a system that required constant coordination. Yet, as this system expanded, maintaining balance became more demanding. Each new territory added not only resources but also responsibility. Routes had to be maintained, obligations had to be enforced, and relationships between different regions required ongoing attention. For the Mexica, this meant that expansion was no longer only about growth. It was about management, how to sustain what had been built, how to ensure that the system continued to function across distance, where direct control was not always possible. Within Tenochtitlan, the effects of this growth were visible. Markets became larger and more active. The variety of goods increased, and the movement of people and resources through the city reflected a network that extended far beyond the lake. Daily life, while still following established rhythms, became more structured. Work was more specialized. Roles were more clearly defined, and the coordination required to maintain the city's functioning increased alongside its size. Yet, beneath this organization, there were moments that revealed the limits of expansion. Not all campaigns brought immediate success. Some regions resisted. Others required repeated effort to remain within the system. These were not failures in a dramatic sense. They were signals, indications that the system, while strong, was not without strain. As I reflect on this period, there is something quietly instructive in how growth, when sustained over time, begins to reveal its own challenges. How systems that expand successfully must also learn how to absorb the complexity that expansion creates. For Aztec leadership required navigating this balance, continuing expansion where possible, maintaining control where necessary, and ensuring that the structure of the empire remained intact, even as it became more difficult to manage. Within the broader region, relationships between communities were shaped by this expanding system. Some adapted and integrated more easily. Others remained at the edges, participating through obligation rather than alignment. This variation created a system that was not uniform. It was layered. Different regions experienced the empire in different ways, and maintaining cohesion across these differences required constant attention. By the latter part of the 15th century, the Mexica Empire had reached a level of scale that was both impressive and demanding. Its reach extended across large areas. Its systems connected multiple regions, and its central city, Tenochtitlan, functioned as the core of a network that required continuous coordination. Yet, within this scale, the nature of power had begun to shift slightly, not in strength, but in weight. The system was no longer light. It required effort to sustain, attention to maintain, and awareness to adapt. And as this weight continued to grow, as the system became more complex, more connected, and more demanding, the Mexica were entering a phase where success would no longer depend only on expansion, but on their ability to carry what they had built without allowing its complexity to become a source of imbalance. By the late 15th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to carry the growing weight of its own expansion, the balance between strength and stability entered a more uncertain phase, one in which leadership would play a decisive role in determining whether the system could continue to function effectively. At this point in time, following the reign of Aztec, leadership passed to Tizoc, whose rule unfolded within an empire that was already vast, organized, and increasingly complex. Yet under Tizoc, the pace of expansion slowed. Campaigns were less effective. Results were less consistent, and the outward momentum that had defined earlier periods of growth began to weaken. This did not immediately disrupt the system. The tribute network remained in place. Tenochtitlan continued to function, and the structure of the empire did not collapse. But the difference was noticeable. Because in a system that depended on both expansion and coordination, a reduction in effectiveness at the center could gradually influence how the entire structure operated. For the Mexica, this period introduced a subtle but important shift, not in the existence of power, but in its expression. Leadership, which had previously driven expansion and maintained direction, now appeared less decisive, and that change, though not dramatic, affected how the system moved forward. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly revealing in how large systems often depend on continuity at the top, and how even a slight change in leadership effectiveness can alter the pace at which the system develops. Because strength, once established, must still be maintained, and maintenance requires clarity, direction, and the ability to act when needed. By the later years of Tizoc's rule, it had become clear that adjustment was necessary, not through dismantling the system, but through restoring its momentum. And it was within this context that leadership passed to Ahuitzotl. With his rise, the tone of the empire shifted once again. Not abruptly, but with increasing clarity. Campaigns resumed with greater coordination. Expansion regained its direction, and the system, which had begun to slow, moved forward with renewed energy. Ahuitzotl did not simply continue what had existed. He strengthened it. He reorganized elements of the system to improve efficiency, ensuring that the tribute network functioned more consistently and that communication across regions remained reliable. At the same time, he extended the reach of the empire further than before, incorporating new territories and reinforcing control over existing ones, not only through military presence but through structured integration. Within Tenochtitlan, this renewed momentum was reflected in the development of the city itself. Infrastructure expanded, public works increased, and the scale of construction began to reflect the growing confidence and capacity of the empire. The city was no longer only adapting to growth. It was expressing it through structure, through organization, and through the visible presence of a system that had regained its direction. Daily life continued to follow established rhythms, yet the scale of activity increased. Markets expanded further. Movement across the canals became more frequent, and the presence of goods from distant regions became even more integrated into the daily functioning of the city. For the Mexica, this period represented a return to momentum. But it was not the same as before. The system was larger, more complex, and more dependent on coordination than it had been in earlier phases. As I consider this, there is a quiet lesson in how systems, when they slow, do not always collapse, but instead reach a point where adjustment becomes necessary, and how leadership, when aligned with structure, can restore movement without needing to rebuild from the beginning. By the end of the 15th century, under Ahuitzotl, the Mexica Empire had reached one of its highest points of expansion. Its reach extended across vast regions. Its systems functioned with increasing efficiency, and Tenochtitlan stood at the center of a network that was both extensive and organized. Yet, within this renewed strength, the underlying complexity remained. The system was powerful, but it was also demanding, and maintaining that balance would continue to require attention, because as the empire approached its peak, the conditions that supported its strength were also shaping the challenges that would eventually test it. By the late 15th century, as the reign of Ahuitzotl brought renewed expansion and strengthened coordination across the Mexica Empire, Tenochtitlan reached a stage where its growth, structure, and influence aligned, creating a period that can be understood as the height of its development. At this point in time, the city stood not only as a political center but as a fully realized system, where agriculture, trade, governance, and daily life functioned together in a way that reflected both scale and balance. The Chinampa system extended across the waters surrounding the city, producing consistent and abundant crops that supported a large and growing population. Canals formed a network of movement that connected different parts of the city, allowing goods, people, and information to travel efficiently across space that had once seemed unstable. Causeways linked Tenochtitlan to the mainland, providing controlled access points that supported both trade and communication, while also reinforcing the city's position within the broader region. At the same time, the urban structure of the city had become more defined. Districts were organized, spaces were designated for specific functions, and the layout of the city reflected a level of planning that allowed it to operate with increasing efficiency as its population expanded. Markets played a central role in daily life. They were not only places of exchange, but points of connection, where goods from across the empire could be seen, traded, and distributed, creating a sense of integration between distant regions and the center. The presence of these goods reflected the reach of the empire. Textiles, food, crafted items, and materials from various environments flowed into the city, supporting both its economy and its role as a hub within a larger network. Leadership within this system had also become more structured. Authority was clearly defined, responsibilities were organized, and the coordination required to manage a system of this scale was maintained through established patterns of governance. Yet, despite this structure, daily life remained grounded in routine. people moved along canals, worked within fields, participated in trade, and lived within a system that, while complex, provided a sense of continuity and predictability. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly remarkable in how a system, when balanced, can sustain both scale and stability. How growth, when supported by structure, does not necessarily lead to instability, but can instead create a rhythm that allows complexity to function smoothly over time. For the Mexica, this period represented more than strength. It represented alignment. Their environment, their systems, and their leadership were working together in a way that allowed the city to operate at a high level of efficiency. Tenochtitlan was no longer defined by its challenges. It was defined by its capability. By the end of the 15th century, its influence extended across a wide region. Its systems connected multiple territories, and its presence within the Valley of Mexico was both visible and central. Yet, even at this height, there remained underlying dynamics that required attention. The system depended on consistent tribute, on stable relationships, and on the ability to maintain coordination across distance. These conditions, while currently stable, were not fixed. They required ongoing management, and they depended on the balance between authority and integration. Within the city, life continued with a steady rhythm. The movement of goods, the cycles of agriculture, the coordination of work, all contributing to a system that, for the moment, functioned with clarity and stability. And as this period continued, as the Mexica Empire reached its fullest expression of organization and influence, it stood as an example of what could be built through adaptation, structure, and time, yet also as a system whose very scale would shape the challenges it would eventually face, as the balance it had achieved would not remain unchanged. By the late 15th century, as Tenochtitlan stood at the height of its development, the structure of the empire could be understood not only through its expansion or its systems of power, but through the quiet rhythms of daily life, the repeated patterns that sustained the city from one day to the next. At this point in time, the population of Tenochtitlan had grown to a level that required coordination across nearly every aspect of life. Yet that coordination did not always appear as complexity. It appeared as routine. As the day began, movement started gradually. Light reached across the surface of Lake Texcoco, reflecting against the water that surrounded the city, while within the residential districts, activity unfolded in a steady and predictable way. People prepared for work. Food was gathered and distributed, and the pathways of the city, both on land and across water, began to fill with movement. Canoes moved along the canals, carrying goods, tools, and people between different parts of the city, following routes that had become familiar through repetition. On the Chinampas, work had already begun. Farmers tended to crops, maintaining the balance between water and soil, ensuring that each section remained stable and productive. Planting, harvesting, and maintenance followed cycles that were closely observed, not only for efficiency, but for continuity. Within the city, markets became active as the morning progressed. These spaces were organized, not chaotic. Goods were arranged, trades were conducted, and people moved through them with purpose, contributing to a system of exchange that connected local production with resources from across the empire. The presence of distant goods was visible here. Items from regions beyond the valley appeared alongside those produced within the city, creating a sense of connection to a wider network that extended far beyond what could be seen directly. Daily life was not uniform. Different roles shaped different experiences. Craftsmen worked within designated areas, producing tools, textiles, and objects that supported both daily function and broader exchange. Others were involved in transport, moving goods along canals or across causeways, ensuring that the flow of resources remained consistent throughout the city. And within households, routines continued: food preparation, maintenance of living spaces, care for family, all forming part of a structure that, while the simple in each individual action, contributed to the stability of the system as a whole. As I reflect on this, there is something quietly significant in how large systems are sustained not by single moments of power, but by repeated actions, carried out each day, often without attention. How stability emerges from consistency rather than from constant change. For the Mexica, this consistency allowed the city to function at scale. It created predictability, it supported coordination, and it allowed a large population to live within a shared environment that required balance across many elements. As the day continued, movement remained steady. Goods flowed, work progressed, and the patterns established over time continued to repeat, reinforcing the structure of the city with each cycle. By evening, activity began to slow. Markets closed. Movement across the canals decreased, and the city settled into a quieter state, though not entirely still. Because even in rest, the system remained. Water moved, structures held, and the foundation that supported daily life continued beneath the surface. This rhythm, repeated day after day, formed the true structure of Tenochtitlan. Not only its buildings, not only its systems, but its continuity. And within that continuity, the city sustained itself, not through constant expansion, but through the quiet repetition of life within a system that, for this moment, remained in balance. By the late 15th century, as Tenochtitlan continued to function at the height of its organization and stability, the structure of the city was shaped not only by its physical systems, but by something less visible. A framework of belief that influenced how people understood the world around them and their place within it. At this point in time, religion was not separate from daily life. It was integrated into it. Ritual, ceremony, and shared belief formed a layer of meaning that connected individual actions to a broader understanding of continuity, balance, and existence. At the center of this system stood the temples of Tenochtitlan. These were not only physical structures, they were points of alignment, spaces where the community gathered, where ceremonies were conducted, and where the relationship between people, nature, and the forces they believed shaped the world was expressed. Over time, these structures had grown in scale and significance. What had once been modest had become more defined, more central, and more integrated into the identity of the city itself. The temple complex, positioned within the organized layout of Tenochtitlan, served as a focal point. Not only geographically, but symbolically. It represented continuity, connection, and the idea that the functioning of the world depended on balance. Daily life reflected this connection. Rituals were not limited to specific moments. They were present in patterns, in cycles, in the way time was observed and marked through recurring events that gave a structure to the year. Certain days carried meaning. Certain actions were performed at specific times. And through these repeated practices, a shared understanding was maintained across the population. For the Mexica, belief was not abstract. It was practical. It shaped decisions. It influenced behavior. And it provided a framework through which uncertainty could be understood. As I reflect on this, there is something quietly significant in how systems of belief do not only explain the world, but help organize it, creating patterns that allow individuals to act within a larger structure with a sense of purpose and continuity. Within the temple spaces, ceremonies were conducted with care and precision. Participants followed established forms. Movements were deliberate, and the repetition of these actions reinforced both tradition and structure. These moments were not isolated from daily life. They were connected to it, providing rhythm, providing reference, and maintaining a sense of alignment between the city and the world it existed within. At the same time, those who guided these practices held defined roles. They were responsible for maintaining the structure of ritual, for observing cycles, and for ensuring that the patterns of belief continued consistently over time. This added another layer to the organization of the city, one that extended beyond governance and economy, into meaning, into identity, into how the Mexica understood themselves as part of something larger. Yet, even within this structured system, belief was not static. It adapted. It responded to changes in the environment, in the city, and in the broader system of the empire. As the Mexica expanded their influence, their system of belief expanded with it, integrating new elements while maintaining continuity with what had already been established. By the end of the 15th century, this framework of belief had become inseparable from the structure of Tenochtitlan. It was present in the layout of the city, in the rhythm of daily life, and in the shared understanding that connected individuals to the system as a whole. And as this structure continued to function, as ritual and routine reinforced one another, the city remained in balance, supported not only by its physical systems, but by the meanings that gave those systems purpose, even as, beyond that balance, conditions were beginning to form that would eventually test how that meaning and that structure would endure. By the late 15th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to function at its peak, the expansion that had shaped its rise was no longer a series of isolated campaigns, but a structured system, one that connected military action with political organization and economic flow. At this point in time, warfare was not separate from the functioning of the empire. It was integrated into it. Campaigns were planned, coordinated, and carried out in ways that reflected the broader structure of the system, linking expansion directly to the movement of tribute and the extension of influence across regions. This was not constant conflict. It followed patterns, periods of preparation, moments of movement, and phases of consolidation that ensured newly connected regions could be integrated into the existing network. Within Tenochtitlan, preparation for campaigns involved coordination across multiple levels. Leaders determined direction, messengers carried information, and groups were organized according to roles that had become more clearly defined over time. Warriors were not a single group. They were part of a structured system. Experience mattered, position mattered, and participation in campaigns contributed not only to expansion, but to individual standing within the broader social structure. For many, involvement in warfare was not only an obligation, it was a path, a way to move within the system, to gain recognition, and to become part of the structure that shaped the empire's direction. As campaigns moved outward, they were not only about confrontation, they were about establishing connection. Regions that came under the influence of the Mexica system were not always transformed immediately. Local structures often remained. Leadership continued. But they became part of a larger network defined by obligation and coordination. This approach allowed the empire to expand without requiring constant direct control. It created a system where influence could be maintained across distance, supported by the regular movement of tribute and the expectation of continued alignment. As I reflect on this, there is something quietly significant in how systems of expansion depend not only on strength, but on integration. How the ability to connect regions into a functioning network often determines whether expansion can be sustained over time. Within the city, the effects of this system were visible. Goods continued to arrive. Markets remained active, and the flow of resources supported both daily life and the broader structure of the empire. Yet, beneath this stability, the system required constant attention. Campaigns needed coordination. Relationships needed maintenance, and the balance between expansion and control had to be managed carefully. Because expansion, if not integrated, can create instability. And stability in a system of this scale depends on maintaining connection across distance. Daily life for those involved in this system reflected its structure. Some prepared for campaigns, others supported the movement of goods, and many continued their roles within the city, contributing to the functioning of a system that extended far beyond what they could directly see. This created a layered experience, where individual action, whether in warfare or in daily work, contributed to a larger process that shaped the direction of the empire. By the end of the 15th century, the Mexica military system had become more than a means of expansion. It had become a mechanism of organization, a way to maintain influence, to reinforce structure, and to ensure that the network connecting the empire remained active. Yet within this system, there remained an important balance. Because while strength allowed expansion and structure allowed integration, the system still depended on continuity, on consistent participation, and on the ability to manage complexity as it continued to grow. And as this balance was maintained, as campaigns extended outward and connections were reinforced, the Mexica Empire continued to function as a system where power, movement, and organization were closely aligned. Even as the scale of that system continued to increase in ways that would, over time, begin to test how long such alignment could be sustained. By the late 15th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to function at its height, the movement of goods across its network had become as important as the expansion that created it, forming a system of exchange that connected distant regions to the center through regular and structured interaction. At this point in time, trade was not separate from the empire's organization. It was part of it. Goods moved along established roads, linking communities through patterns of exchange that reflected both local production and the broader reach of the tribute system. Within Tenochtitlan, this movement became most visible in its markets. These were not informal gatherings. They were organized spaces where exchange took place with consistency, bringing together people from different regions, each contributing to the flow of goods that sustained the city. Among these, the market of Tlatelolco stood out. Located adjacent to Tenochtitlan, it functioned as one of the largest and most active centers of exchange in the region, where a wide variety of goods could be found, arranged, and traded within a structured environment. Here, goods from across the empire appeared together. Food, textiles, tools, and crafted items from distant areas were brought into a shared space, creating a point where the diversity of the empire became visible in everyday life. The market was organized. Sections were designated for different types of goods. Movement followed patterns, and exchange was conducted within a system that allowed consistency across large numbers of people. This structure did not remove complexity, but it made it manageable. It allowed a large volume of interaction to take place without becoming disordered. Daily life within the city was closely connected to this system. People visited markets regularly. Goods moved between households, producers, and traders, and the presence of exchange became a constant part of the rhythm of the city. For those involved directly in trade, movement extended beyond the city. Traders traveled across regions, carrying goods between communities, contributing to the connections that linked the empire together. These journeys required knowledge of routes, of conditions, and of the relationships that allowed movement across different areas. As I reflect on this system, there is something quietly significant in how exchange does more than move goods. It moves information, connection, and understanding, linking regions together in ways that extend beyond the physical items being traded. For the Mexica, this network of exchange strengthened the structure of the empire. It supported daily life, it reinforced connections between regions, and it allowed the system to function with a level of coordination that matched its scale. Within Tenochtitlan, the presence of goods from distant areas created a sense of continuity between the city and the wider world. What arrived at the market reflected what existed beyond the valley, and what moved outward carried with it the influence of the center. Yet this system also depended on stability. Routes had to remain accessible, relationships had to remain functional, and the flow of goods required consistency over time, because when movement is interrupted, the effects are felt across the system. By the end of the 15th century, the market system had become one of the defining features of the Mexica world, not only as a place of exchange, but as a structure that connected the empire together through repeated interaction. And as this system continued to function, as goods moved, and people participated in the rhythms of exchange, it supported a level of stability that allowed the empire to operate at scale. Even as the complexity of that system continued to grow in ways that would require constant balance to maintain. By the late 15th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to function across its full extent, the systems that had been built over generations reached a point where they aligned with one another, creating a period in which expansion, organization, daily life, and belief existed in a state of relative balance. At this point in time, Tenochtitlan stood at the center of a network that extended across multiple regions, supported by the steady flow of tribute, the movement of goods through markets, and the coordination of leadership across the structure of the Triple Alliance. The city itself reflected this balance. Agriculture provided consistent supply. Trade connected distant regions. Governance maintained order, and daily life followed patterns that allowed the system to function without visible disruption. This did not mean that challenges no longer existed. It meant that they were being managed, integrated into a structure that could absorb variation without losing stability. Within the city, movement continued as it had in previous years. Canals carried goods and people. Markets operated with regularity, and the rhythms of work and rest followed patterns that had become familiar through repetition. Beyond the city, the system extended outward. Regions connected through tribute and exchange maintained their positions within the network, contributing to a structure that relied on consistency across distance. For the Mexica, this period represented not only strength but alignment. The systems they had built were functioning together, not perfectly, but effectively. And in that effectiveness, the empire reached what could be understood as its most stable form. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quiet in how stability often feels unremarkable while it is present. How systems that function well do not always draw attention to themselves, because their strength lies in continuity rather than disruption. Yet, within that continuity, there is also something else, a kind of stillness that can exist at the height of development, a moment where growth has reached its current limit, and the system exists not in expansion, but in maintenance. For the Mexica, this did not signal an end, but it did mark a transition, from building to sustaining. And sustaining, over time, requires a different kind of awareness, because maintaining balance is not the same as creating it. It requires attention to small changes, to shifts that may not be immediately visible, but that, over time, can influence how the system functions. Within Tenochtitlan, life continued with a steady rhythm. The city did not appear to be changing rapidly. It appeared to be holding its form, and in that stillness the structure of the empire remained intact. Yet beyond that surface, the conditions that supported this balance were not fixed. They depended on continued coordination, on stable relationships, and on the ability to respond when change emerged. As I consider this, there is something quietly instructive in how the height of a system is not only defined by its strength, but by its ability to recognize that stability itself is a phase, one that exists within a larger process of change. By the end of the 15th century, the Mexica Empire stood at this point: strong, organized, and functioning with clarity, yet also positioned within a moment where the future was not yet defined, where the balance that had been achieved would need to be maintained or adapted as new conditions began to appear. And as this period of stability continued, as the systems of the empire operated in alignment, the next phase of its history would not begin with sudden disruption, but with subtle shifts that would gradually move the balance in ways that could not yet be fully seen. By the turn of the 16th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to exist within a state of balance, daily life in Tenochtitlan remained structured, predictable, and sustained by systems that had been refined over generations. Yet, within this continuity, small and often unnoticed shifts had begun to form. At this point in time, the city still functioned with clarity. The canals remained active. The chinampas continued to produce. Markets operated with regularity, and the flow of goods from distant regions still reached the center without visible disruption. From the perspective of daily life, little appeared to be changing. People followed familiar routines. Work began and ended in expected patterns, and the structure of the city supported a rhythm that had become deeply established over time. Yet, as this continued, there were moments, subtle and not always clearly defined, where variation began to appear, not in a way that disrupted the system, but in ways that suggested that the balance, while still present, required more attention to maintain. In some regions connected to the empire, the demands of tribute had become more noticeable. Communities continued to contribute, yet the relationship between obligation and participation was not always uniform. Some adapted easily. Others required more oversight, and maintaining consistency across distance became a more active process. Within the city, these shifts were not always visible in daily routine. Markets remained active, goods continued to circulate, and life on the surface appeared unchanged. But beneath that surface, the system required constant adjustment. Routes had to be maintained more carefully. Relationships required more attention, and the coordination that supported stability was no longer effortless. As I reflect on this phase, there is something quiet in how change often begins. Not through sudden disruption, but through small variations in patterns that have long appeared stable. These variations do not immediately alter the structure. They exist within it, gradually, almost without notice. For the Mexica, this was not yet a period of decline. It was a period of awareness, of recognizing that the system, while still strong, was becoming more dependent on continuous effort to maintain its balance. Daily life continued. People moved along canals, worked within fields, participated in markets, and lived within a structure that still provided stability and predictability. Yet the ease of that stability had begun to shift. What had once functioned with minimal adjustment now required more attention, more coordination, more presence within the system itself. By the early 16th century, the empire remained intact. Its reach was still extensive. Its system still functioned, and Tenochtitlan remained at the center of a network that connected multiple regions. But the nature of that system had changed slightly. Not in form, but in effort. It required more to maintain, more to sustain, and more awareness of the conditions that allowed it to function. As I consider this, there is something quietly instructive in how stability is not a fixed state, but an ongoing process, one that must be maintained continuously, and one that can shift without immediate visibility. For the Mexica, this moment existed between two phases. The balance they had achieved remained, but the conditions supporting it were beginning to change. And, as these subtle shifts continued, as patterns required more attention to sustain, the system moved, gradually and almost imperceptibly, toward a phase where balance would become more difficult to maintain, even as, on the surface, everything still appeared the same. By the early 16th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to function within a state that still appeared stable on the surface, leadership passed to Moctezuma II, whose reign would unfold during a time when the balance of the system required more deliberate control and more visible structure. At this point in time, the empire remained extensive. Its networks still connected distant regions. Its tribute system still functioned, and Tenochtitlan continued to operate as the center of a complex and coordinated system. Yet the subtle shifts that had begun in earlier years had not disappeared. They had continued, gradually, quietly. And under Moctezuma II, the response to these shifts took the form of increased centralization. Authority became more defined, more concentrated. Decisions were more closely controlled, and the structure of leadership reflected a need to maintain order within a system that was becoming more demanding to manage. This did not immediately change daily life for most people. The city still moved with familiar rhythms. Markets continued. Agriculture remained productive, and the visible structure of the empire appeared intact. But within that structure, the relationship between the center and the regions it connected began to shift. Tribute expectations became more formalized. Oversight became more direct, and the distance between those who governed and those who contributed became more pronounced. For the Mexica, this represented a subtle transformation, not in the existence of power, but in how it was expressed. What had once functioned through a balance of coordination and integration began to rely more heavily on control and structure. As I reflect on this period, there is something quietly significant in how systems, when they become more complex, often move toward centralization. Not necessarily as a sign of strength, but as a response to the increasing difficulty of maintaining balance across distance. Because as systems grow, coordination becomes more demanding, and in response, control often becomes more visible. Within Tenochtitlan, this shift was reflected in the organization of leadership and the expectations placed upon different roles within the city. Responsibilities were more clearly defined, positions carried greater formality, and the structure of authority became more pronounced. At the same time, the symbolic presence of leadership increased. The figure of Moctezuma II was not only a political role, it became a representation of the system itself, of its order, its continuity, and its authority. Daily life, however, remained grounded in routine. People continued their work, markets remained active, and the rhythms that sustained the city continued to repeat. Yet the tone of the system had changed, subtly, but noticeably. What had once felt balanced now required more direction, more oversight, and more presence from the center. Beyond the city, these changes were more apparent. Communities within the empire continued to fulfill their obligations, yet the relationship between contribution and participation became more defined by expectation rather than integration. This did not immediately create instability, but it altered the nature of the system. It made it more structured, more controlled, and in some ways, less flexible. By the early decades of the 16th century, the Mexica Empire remained strong. Its reach was still wide, its systems still functioned, and its capital still stood as one of the most organized cities in the region. Yet beneath that strength, the balance had shifted, not broken, but adjusted, toward a system that relied more on control than on alignment. And as this shift continued, as centralization increased and the weight of maintaining the system grew, the empire moved into a phase where stability depended not only on structure, but on the ability to respond to changes that had not yet fully appeared, but were already beginning to approach. By the early 16th century, as the Mexica Empire continued to function within a structure that had grown increasingly centralized under Moctezuma II, an event began to unfold beyond the eastern boundaries of their world, one that would gradually move closer, not immediately understood, yet impossible to ignore. At this point in time, the empire remained intact. Tenochtitlan continued to operate with its established rhythms. The tribute system functioned. Markets remained active. And the structure of power, though more concentrated, still held its form. Yet, along the eastern coast, reports began to emerge. Not of familiar movements, not of known groups, but of something different. Strangers had arrived. They came by water, in vessels unlike those used within the region, large, unfamiliar, and carrying individuals whose presence did not fit within the patterns that had long defined interaction across the lands of Mesoamerica. These were the forces led by Hernán Cortés, arriving in 1519. For those who first encountered them, understanding was not immediate. Descriptions moved slowly, through word, through interpretation, through attempts to relate what was seen to what was already known. Yet what was being described did not fully align with existing frameworks. Their materials, their animals, their tools, their behavior, all suggested something that did not easily fit into the established understanding of the world. As news of their arrival traveled inland, it did not create immediate disruption. It created uncertainty, a space between recognition and interpretation. Within Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II received these reports within a system that was already carrying the weight of complexity. Decisions were not made quickly. They required consideration, observation, and an attempt to understand what these arrivals represented. This was not hesitation in the sense of inaction. It was a reflection of the system itself, a system that had been built on structure, on coordination, and on interpreting change through known patterns. Yet this situation did not fully match those patterns, and that difference mattered. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how systems respond to the unfamiliar. How the more structured and stable a system becomes, the more it relies on existing understanding to interpret new conditions. And when something appears that does not fit those patterns, response becomes more difficult. Not because the system is weak, but because it has been built to recognize what it already knows. For the Mexica, the arrival of Cortés was not immediately understood as a threat. It was something to be observed, to be interpreted, to be placed within a framework that could explain it. And in that process, time passed. Cortés and his forces did not remain at the coast. They moved inland, forming alliances with groups who had existing tensions with the Mexica system, learning the structure of the region, and gradually approaching the center. This movement was not hidden, but its meaning was not fully clear, because within the existing system, movement had always followed certain patterns, and this movement, though visible, did not yet appear to follow those same rules. Daily life within Tenochtitlan continued. Markets remained active. The canals carried goods and people, and the rhythms of the city did not immediately change. Yet beneath that continuity, awareness began to shift. Reports became more frequent, information more detailed, and the presence of something unfamiliar moved closer to the center of the system. By the time Cortés approached the Valley of Mexico, the situation could no longer remain distant. It had entered the space in which the Mexica system operated, and the need to respond became more immediate. Yet even then the response was shaped by understanding, by interpretation, by the attempt to place the unfamiliar within a known structure. As I consider this, there is something quietly instructive in how moments of change rarely arrive with clear meaning, how they often appear first as uncertainty, requiring interpretation before action can take form. And in that space between awareness and understanding, the direction of what follows is often shaped. For the Mexica, this moment did not yet represent collapse. It represented encounter. An encounter with something that did not align with what they had known. And as this encounter moved closer, as the unfamiliar became present within the system itself, the balance that had been maintained for generations began to face a condition it had not been built to fully understand. By the year 1519, as the movement of Hernán Cortés and his forces continued inland, what had once been distant reports became a visible presence within the Valley of Mexico, and the space between observation and encounter began to close. At this point in time, Tenochtitlan remained as it had been. The canals moved with steady rhythm. Markets continued their cycles of exchange, and the structure of the city, shaped over generations, still held its form with quiet stability. Yet, beyond the causeways that connected the city to the mainland, something new had arrived. Cortés, accompanied not only by his own forces but by allied groups from within the region, approached the valley with increasing proximity, moving along paths that had long been used for trade and communication. This movement was no longer uncertain. It was present, and it was approaching the center. For Moctezuma II, the decision that followed did not emerge from a single moment. It formed gradually, through interpretation, through consultation, and through the attempt to understand what this arrival represented within the existing structure of the world he knew. The response, when it came, was not immediate resistance. It was reception. Cortés was allowed to enter Tenochtitlan, not as an invader, at least not in the form that had been known before, but as a presence to be observed, to be engaged, and perhaps to be understood. As the group moved along the causeways, the city revealed itself. Water extended outward in every direction. Canals carried movement between structures, and the organized layout of Tenochtitlan, built from adaptation and design, appeared before those who had not seen anything like it before. For the Mexica, this moment was not one of collapse. It was one of contrast. Two systems, two understandings of the world, now existing within the same space. Daily life within the city did not immediately stop. Markets continued, people moved. Work followed its established patterns, yet attention shifted toward the unfamiliar presence that now existed within the structure of the city itself. Cortés and his companions were received with formality, guided through spaces, shown elements of the city, and integrated in a controlled way into the environment that had been carefully maintained over time. This was not surrender. It was structure responding to uncertainty, an attempt to contain the unfamiliar within a framework that could be managed. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how systems often respond to what they do not fully understand, not by rejecting it immediately, but by trying to place it within existing structures, hoping that familiarity can be created through proximity. Yet not all things can be understood in this way. And when something does not align with the system that receives it, the act of bringing it closer does not always create clarity. Sometimes it creates tension. Within Tenochtitlan, that tension remained subtle at first. There were no immediate signs of disruption. The city continued to function. Its systems remained in place. Yet the presence of Cortés within the city altered the balance, not visibly, but structurally, because the system now contained something it had not been built to interpret. Communication continued, observation continued, and both sides moved within a shared space. each attempting to understand the other through their own frameworks. But those frameworks were not the same, and that difference, though not immediately disruptive, began to shape the conditions that followed. By the time Cortés had entered Tenochtitlan, the distance between the two worlds had closed. There was no longer space for interpretation from afar. The encounter was direct, immediate, and contained within the same environment. Yet, understanding had not caught up with proximity, and in that space, between presence and comprehension, the balance of the system began to shift in ways that were not yet fully visible, but were already in motion. In the months following the arrival of Hernán Cortés in 1519, as both the Mexica and the newcomers continued to exist within the same space, the balance that had once held the system together began to shift. Not suddenly, but through a series of changes that gradually altered the structure of the city from within. At this point in time, Tenochtitlan still appeared intact. The canals continued to carry movement. Markets still opened, and daily life, at least on the surface, maintained its familiar rhythm. Yet, beneath that continuity, tension had begun to form. Not always visible, not always spoken, but present in the interactions between two systems that did not fully understand one another. Cortés and his forces, now within the city, did not remain passive. They observed, they positioned themselves, and gradually they began to act in ways that shifted the balance of control. One of the most significant moments came when Moctezuma II, the central figure of authority within the Mexica system, was taken into the custody of the newcomers, an action that did not immediately disrupt the visible structure of the city, but fundamentally altered the nature of power within it. Leadership remained, but its position had changed. Authority still existed, but it was no longer fully independent. For the Mexica, and this created a condition that had not existed before, a system that appeared intact, but was no longer fully in control of itself. Daily life continued. People moved along canals, markets remained active, and routines were followed. Yet the underlying structure had shifted. Decisions were no longer made with the same clarity. Responses were influenced by new constraints, and the balance between leadership and system began to weaken. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how systems do not always break at their edges, but sometimes at their center, when the point that holds structure together is altered, even if the outward form remains unchanged. Because from the outside, the city still functioned, but from within, the alignment had begun to dissolve. As time passed, tension increased. Misunderstandings grew. Actions were taken that could not be easily reversed. Moments of conflict began to emerge, not as full collapse, but as signs, indications that the system, once stable, was no longer able to maintain its previous balance. Within Tenochtitlan, this shift was felt gradually. The rhythms of daily life became less certain. The sense of predictability began to change, and the presence of the newcomers, once contained within structure, became a source of instability. The city, which had been built on coordination and balance, now held within it a tension that could not be fully resolved through the systems that had once sustained it. As I consider this phase, there is something quietly instructive in how change, when it reaches the center of a system, does not always announce itself through immediate collapse, but through a gradual loss of alignment, where the parts continue to function, but no longer move together as they once did. By the end of this period, the condition of Tenochtitlan had shifted. Not completely broken, but no longer stable. The balance that had defined its height was no longer present in the same way. And as this imbalance continued, as tension increased and structure weakened, the system moved toward a point where the changes that had begun quietly would become impossible to contain. By the year 1521, as the tension that had been building within Tenochtitlan could no longer be contained. The system that had once functioned with balance and coordination entered a phase of open disruption, where the structure of the city itself became the space in which conflict unfolded. At this point in time, the presence of Hernan Cortés and his allied forces within the region had expanded beyond observation and positioning. It had become action, not sudden, but sustained, gradually surrounding the city, limiting movement, and altering the conditions that had once allowed Tenochtitlan to function with stability. The causeways that connected the city to the mainland, once pathways of controlled exchange, became points of pressure. Access was restricted, movement was interrupted, and the flow of goods, which had sustained daily life for generations, began to weaken. Within the city, the effects were not immediate. At first, the rhythms of life attempted to continue. Markets opened, people moved, and routines were followed. Yet, as time passed, the conditions began to change. Supplies became less consistent. Water, once abundant and managed, became more difficult to maintain in its previous balance, and the systems that had supported the city began to strain under the new reality. The canals, which had once carried goods and people in steady patterns, now reflected a different kind of movement. Not organized, not predictable, but shaped by necessity, by adjustment, by response to conditions that no longer followed the structures of the past. For the Mexica, this was not a single moment of collapse. It was a process, one that unfolded over time, through gradual change, through increasing limitation, and through the realization that the systems they had built were no longer functioning in the same way. As I reflect on this phase, there is something quietly significant in how systems do not always end through sudden destruction, but through the erosion of the conditions that allow them to operate. How, when movement is restricted, when resources become uncertain, and when coordination becomes difficult, the structure begins to weaken from within. Within Tenochtitlan, daily life became more constrained. Food became less available. Movement required more effort, and the patterns that had once provided stability became harder to maintain. Yet, even within these conditions, life continued. People adapted, they adjusted, they continued to act within the system, even as that system changed around them. This was not immediate stillness. It was a shifting rhythm, one that became slower, less predictable, and more dependent on the ability to respond to each moment as it came. The presence of conflict within the city altered its spaces. Areas that had once been defined by coordination now reflected tension. Not constant, but present. A background condition that influenced how the city moved. By the later stages of the siege, the structure of Tenochtitlan had changed. Not in its form, but in its function. The systems that had once aligned were no longer operating together in the same way. The balance that had defined its height was no longer present, and in its place, a new condition had emerged. One defined not by coordination, but by limitation. As I consider this, there is something quietly instructive in how even the most organized systems depend on conditions that can shift beyond their control, and how, when those conditions change, the system must either adapt in ways it was not built for, or begin to lose the structure that once sustained it. By the time the siege reached its final phase, Tenochtitlan remained standing. Its structures were still present, its spaces still recognizable, yet the system that had once given it life had changed. And as the process continued, as limitation increased and coordination became more difficult, the city moved toward a moment where what had been sustained for generations would no longer be able to continue. By the late summer of 1521, after months of sustained pressure, limited resources, and the gradual weakening of the systems that had once supported it, Tenochtitlan reached a point where continuation was no longer possible, and the structure that had defined the city for generations came to an end. At this point in time, the siege had altered nearly every aspect of life within the city. Movement had slowed, supplies had diminished, and the coordination that once allowed the city to function as a unified system had become increasingly difficult to maintain. The canals, once filled with steady and organized movement, no longer carried the same patterns. The chinampas, which had provided consistent food, could no longer support the needs of the population in the same way, and the connections that had linked the city to the wider world had been disrupted. Yet, even within these conditions, the city did not disappear suddenly. It continued, for a time, holding its form, maintaining what it could, as the process of change reached its final stage. When the end came, it did not arrive as a single moment that could be clearly separated from what came before. It emerged from the accumulation of all that had changed, from the gradual loss of balance, from the steady erosion of the conditions that had once allowed the system to exist. And in that sense, the fall of Tenochtitlan was not only an event, it was a process completing itself. As control of the city shifted, the structures remained. The spaces still existed, but their meaning had changed. The system that had once animated them was no longer present in the same way. For the Mexica, this marked a transformation that extended beyond the physical city. It was not only the loss of a place, but the end of a system, of a way of organizing life, movement, belief, and connection across a wide and coordinated structure. Yet, even in this ending, not everything disappeared. People remained, memory remained, and elements of the system, though altered, continued in different forms. As I reflect on this moment, there is something quietly significant in how endings are rarely absolute. How even when structures fall, what they contained does not vanish completely, but instead changes, adapts, and continues in ways that are not always immediately visible. Because systems are made of patterns, and patterns once formed do not simply stop, they shift, they move, they become part of what follows. In the aftermath, the city that had once been Tenochtitlan began to transform. Its spaces were altered, its structures redefined, and its role within the region changed. Yet, beneath these changes, the foundations remained. The land, the water, the memory of what had been built there. By the end of 1521, the Mexica Empire, as it had existed, was no longer present as a functioning system. Its networks had dissolved, its coordination had ended, and its central city had changed in ways that could not be reversed. Yet its influence did not end completely. It continued, in altered forms, in memory, in the structures that followed. As I consider this, there is something quietly instructive in how even the most powerful systems are not permanent, and how their existence, while significant, is always part of a larger process, one that includes both creation and transformation. For Tenochtitlan, the story had reached its conclusion, but what it had been, and what it had created, did not end entirely. They became part of what came next, even as the system itself came to rest. In the years that followed the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, as the visible structure of the Mexica Empire had come to an end, what remained was not a system that could continue as it once had, but something quieter, less defined, and yet still present beneath the surface of change. At this point in time, the networks that had once connected regions through tribute and coordination no longer functioned in the same way. The central authority that had organized the empire was gone, and the city that had stood at the heart of that system had begun to transform into something new. Yet the end of structure did not mean the end of everything it had created. The patterns remained, not in their original form, but in traces, in memory, in the ways people continued to live, adapt, and respond to the world around them. Daily life did not stop, it changed. Routines adjusted. Spaces were redefined, and the rhythms that had once supported the empire shifted into new forms that reflected a different reality. For those who lived through this transition, the change was not only external, it was internal, a reorientation of understanding, of place, of how the world functioned. As I reflect on this, there is something quiet in how systems, once they end, do not leave behind emptiness, but transformation. How what has been built continues in altered forms, influencing what comes next in ways that are not always immediately visible. Because no system exists in isolation. Each one is part of a longer process, a sequence of development, alignment, and change that extends beyond any single moment. For the Mexica, the empire had been a structure of coordination, of movement, of balance between environment, people, and belief. And while that structure no longer functioned in the same way, the elements that composed it did not disappear. They remained, reconfigured, integrated into what followed. The land of the valley remained. The waters of the lake, though altered, still defined the space, and the memory of the city, of its organization, of its rhythms, continued to exist beyond the physical structures that had changed. As I consider this, there is something quietly instructive in how the rise and fall of a system is not only about its beginning and its end, but about the continuity that exists between those points. How each phase contributes to what follows, even when the original form is no longer present. The Mexica did not simply appear, and they did not simply disappear. They moved through a process, from movement to settlement to expansion to balance and then to transformation. And within that process, there is a pattern, one that extends beyond a single place or time. A pattern in how systems are built, sustained, and eventually reshaped. By the time the early 16th century gave way to what followed, the Mexica Empire, as it had once existed, was no longer present. Yet its presence remained, not as a structure, but as influence, as part of the foundation upon which new systems would be built. As I reflect further, there is something calm in recognizing that no system, no matter how organized or powerful, remains unchanged, and that what endures is not the structure itself, but the patterns it leaves behind. And perhaps, in that understanding, there is a way to see the story of the Mexica not only as a rise and fall, but as part of a larger continuity, one that moves beyond the boundaries of any single empire, and settles over time into something quieter, something that no longer needs to hold its form, but simply remains as part of what continues. And now, as the story begins to settle, there is no longer a need to follow each moment or to hold on to each detail. The city has already risen, and it has already fallen, and what remains is something quieter, something that does not move with events, but rests beneath them, like still water after a long day of wind. You can allow the images to soften, the canals, the causeways, the distant outline of the city upon the lake, all becoming less clear, less defined, as if they are slowly drifting away. There is no need to see them sharply now. They have already been understood, and they can gently fade. As your attention begins to loosen, there is less to follow, less to connect, less to hold together. And in that space, the rhythm slows, becoming softer, more even, more calm. Breathing becomes steady, quiet, and unforced, each breath arriving and leaving without effort, without urgency. As I reflect here, at the end of this long movement through time, there is something gentle in the way all things, no matter how structured, no matter how carefully built, eventually return to stillness, not suddenly, but gradually, over time, until what once moved with purpose simply rests, and perhaps there is nothing more to do with that. No need to hold on to what has passed. No need to follow what comes next. The story has already reached its place, and it no longer needs to continue. You can let it go now, let it drift, like the surface of the lake at night, calm, unbroken, reflecting a sky that does not move. There are no demands here, no expectations, only the quiet rhythm of breath and the soft sense of everything settling. As your body becomes heavier and your thoughts become lighter, there is less to notice, less to follow, less to remain awake for. Only rest, only stillness, only the gentle space, where everything, gradually, fades. And here, nothing is required, nothing is waiting, nothing is unfinished. Only quiet, only calm, only rest and sleep.